So I picked this book up like a year and a half ago, and I didn't know much about Rosacrucianism until I read it, and I was just interested in, the Western mystery tradition and the different things that came out of it, or that it came from. And after reading it, I had it in my mind that it's a hell of a story. It's a lot of cool history in there, man. Things that aren't really talked about. Anyway, yeah, I don't have a lapel mic, and I had it set in my mind that I wanted to do a video on it for a while now. So there's a little bit of a hurricane right off the coast if you saw the lights flicker. Anyway, yeah. So this is by Francis Yates, the late Francis Yates, the Renaissance historian. The Rosicrucian Enlightenment is about two events that took place in the 17th century, so we're talking 1600s Europe, one of which being a royal wedding between an English princess and a German prince, and the other event being some mysterious letters that went into circulation shortly before, called the Rosicrucian Manifestos. And we're going to explore all that. I wrote notes on the book, and I'll be reading directly from my notes also. So that was written in 1972 by Yates. By her own admission, it was a pioneering work, and she had hoped that others would add on to it, and she knew that people would find mistakes in her work, but she comes from a very academic background, and she objectively looks at all the characters, facts, and events in a very digestible way. So that's why after hearing this story, it's filled with romance, action. I mean, it would rival a Hollywood production. And to think that, these events really happened, I had to share it. And for those who don't have time to read the book, like some of my friends are in school right now or whatnot, I wanted to do the video. And for those of you who do have the privilege, go ahead and get that. Also, Rosicrucian Enlightenment Revisited. This was from the 95 conferences over in Europe of the people, who followed the book. Whatever backgrounds they came from, historians, just hobbyists, whatever. Rosicrucians themselves, there's different orders around the world. Another thing, she looks at it from its historical context, the movement. Rosicrucians in a historical context. There's a lot of groups that that operate under the Rosicrucian name now, but we're talking historically 17th century. So yeah, this is Revisited. I have yet to read it. It's a series of lectures and papers from those who attended the conferences. But anyway, let's get to it. So let's put the era in context. We're talking about 17th century Europe. It's at the turn of the century, entering the 1600s. It's a period of rapid change. 1500s in Europe onward is regarded as the rise of Western civilization. Europe had come directly out of the Renaissance, spearheaded by Italy. So during the Italian Renaissance, there was an uptick in science, art, literature, and philosophy. It had ripples across Europe. The Renaissance can be attributed directly to Venetian states, which saw a robust economy and relative tolerance for free thinking. This fueled intellectual inspiration. So basically, there was an inflow of money, more time for the arts, and for people. I'm on call in this hurricane. I don't know if this video is going to happen. So basically, the Renaissance was a period of inspired intellect. According to the Italian humanists, it was a change from the Dark Ages, which was marked by famine, wars, and ignorance. This can be directly attributed to the Venetian states, which saw a robust economy and relative tolerance for free thinking, fueling intellectual inspiration. The Italian Renaissance is known as a period of renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman culture. So Northern Europe kind of followed suit afterwards. They had their own enlightenment, in the 1500s, and for some of the same reasons. A trending economy, which was due to trade and technological advances, most notably shipping and new trade routes which were being discovered. And with those trade routes, there was an exchange of ideas. Also in Europe, there was reformations taking place in the 1500s, and also underlying esoteric movements. So we're talking about a change in economy, a change in thought. So there's a direct correlation there, it seems. The events that we're discussing here take place in the 1600s, coming out of the 1500s. Northern Europe, the regions we're focusing on specifically will be what we know as modern-day Germany. Let's take a look at Germany here, a map showing all the states within the region. And England. England is the other player in the game. England was coming out of their golden age under Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was known for being religiously tolerant, and England boomed with intellectual thought and scientific advancement during this era. We're talking 1500s England. So going into the 1600s, England was coming out of a golden age and looking to continue that. Now in Germany during the 1500s, there was a lot of war until the Peace of Augsburg. There was a line of tolerant emperors which ruled for 60 years, as a good break from that war. The last of which being Emperor Rudolph II, who was tolerant of Lutherans and was also interested in esoteric studies himself. The capital of the Holy Roman Empire was moved to Prague, and in Prague, Emperor Rudolph II reigned, and Prague became a mecca for progressive ideas and intellectual thought. When Rudolph II died, however, a less tolerant king, King Ferdinand, took over the throne, and all bets were off. All right, so chapter 1, we're going to talk about the royal wedding of Frederick V and Princess Elizabeth Stuart. So the Rosacrucian movement takes place between the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. That's the 1600s. And it's based on Hermetic Kabbalism with alchemy mixed in. So one figure that's going to come up through the book is John Dee in England. He's a major figure we'll explore in the Renaissance Hermetic tradition, and John Dee is a mathematician, astrologer, occult philosopher, and writer. So Dee kind of straddled between math and magic. He got in trouble earlier in his life, but he maneuvered to clear his name. Queen Elizabeth I, not to be confused with Princess Elizabeth, who we'll be talking about, different family line, but Queen Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, and Dee became her trusted advisor. Queen Elizabeth now was also interested in esoteric things. So Dee's later life, he leaves England into Central Europe, and this is a portion of his life that's not well documented. Dee's 8 years abroad in Central Europe, he was practicing alchemy, numerology, angelology with Edward Kelly. This is a period in Dee's life that's not well known once again, and pioneering works like the one by Francis Yates here look to shed some light on this. Yates theorizes that what Dee had set up in Germany paved the way for the royal wedding and its underlying esoteric movement. So, to put it in context, Dee's travels through Germany were before the royal wedding that was to take place in Bohemia. So we're talking Dee in the late 1500s, and then the royal wedding, 20 years later, early 1600s. Okay, so what was going on across the water? Likewise, in England, it was experiencing a time of Renaissance. England was optimistic for a continuation of the successful Elizabethan era. England warmly welcomed the marriage of King James' daughter, Princess Elizabeth, with Protestant noble Frederick V. This was a time of peace, intellectual hope, prolific literature, and religious toleration going into the new century. But, as Yates adds, there were dark shadows behind the splendors of this wedding. It started with the death of Princess Elizabeth's brother, Prince Henry. Uh, it kind of ruined King James' plan to marry his son to a Catholic princess and his daughter to a Protestant prince. That was James' master plan to usher in peace. He was trying to broker peace because, politically it was advantageous to appease all parties. The main parties being the Protestants and the other one being the Catholic powers. So let's talk about the actual royal wedding of his daughter and the German Protestant prince. King James' daughter married Protestant Prince Frederick V in early 1613 and they moved into Heidelberg Castle in the Electoral Palatinate. So side note, I might mispronounce some things here, but hopefully you could get the gist of what's going on. So they moved into Heidelberg Castle. The castle was known to have many splendors, at least under their reign. Their court attracted renowned engineers who transformed the castle with elaborate Renaissance gardens that included mechanical statues, musical fountains, and other state-of-the-art wonders. It was said that this technology was simulated by ancient texts describing such marvels. Princess Elizabeth loved drama, and they courted traveling companies of English players. Their court had a fancy for literary works, which were exchanged back and forth between Heidelberg and London. So, between England and Germany, it kind of became a corridor of intellect with English drama travelers and literary works being exchanged. So what Yates is doing here is trying to explore the culture that was established at Heidelberg under the court of Frederick V and Elizabeth Stuart. So we're going to talk about the Bohemian tragedy, the tragic side of this story. Frederick V was seen as the next up leader of the Union German Protestant princes. These are people who were up against the Habsburg power, so Habsburg being Catholic. The tolerant Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II really posed no threat. After Rudolph died in 1612, the question became how long would the toleration last? So we already talked about Ferdinand coming in as the new emperor, and the answer is the peace didn't last very long. There was a set of events which took place in very dramatic fashion, where Protestant chapels were closed down, violating previous treaties. Violence erupted, leading to 2 Catholic officials convicted of violations being thrown out of a window of the conference room in Prague Castle. This event became known as the Defenestration of Prague. Bohemia was now in open rebellion to the Habsburg powers. On August 26, 1619, the Bohemians decided to offer their crown to Frederick, the Elector of Palatine. Frederick was torn whether to accept the crown or not, but ultimately he did under what he thought of being a moral obligation to God. Frederick and Elizabeth left for Prague in September to accept their throne and be coronated by the Church of Bohemia. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's father, King James, who was hell-bent on Spanish appeasement, did not support his daughter and son-in-law's move. Yates in this book mentions that even Queen Elizabeth would have thought twice. So they leave Heidelberg Castle on their way to Prague to accept the crown of Bohemia after the Bohemians, the local Protestant leaders, were in open rebellion and basically threw out the Catholic Habsburg powers. So very dramatic, intense situation developing here. So they get to Prague, they get coronated at the Church of Bohemia, and during the winter of 1619 to 1620, Frederick and Elizabeth reigned in Prague as King and Queen of Bohemia. Frederick's enemies gathered in the background. Christian Anhalt commanded Frederick's forces, and the Duke of Bavaria commanded the Catholic armies. The Battle of White Mountain took place outside of Prague in November 1620. Frederick's forces were wiped out. Frederick and his family left in such a hurry from Prague that they left most of their possessions. Mass executions commenced in Bohemia and erased the Bohemian church. Heidelberg Library was destroyed or confiscated. King James's non-intervention angered British Parliament, who supported their princess. That would eventually start a chain of events that led to the undoing of the Stuart monarchy. The event cast ripples throughout Europe. Yates suggests, had Frederick succeeded in keeping open a liberal corridor from Holland to Venice through Germany, the advance of thought repression in Italy, from which Galileo was to suffer, might have been checked. Figures like Christian Anhalt and others of the Bohemian family would have progressed with their occult and alchemical interests. So we're going to look at the actual Rosicrucian manifestos and see if there was some sort of mention of a royal wedding in here. What Yates is doing is connecting the dots and just exploring the different avenues that can suggest a cross relationship between the Bohemian court and the Rosicrucian movement that sprung up in Europe. So the Rosicrucian manifestos were two short pamphlets published in Cassel in 1614 and 1616. There was a third work published called Chemical Wedding of the Christian Rosacruz in 1616 as well. The manifestos urged others to join. Regarding the chemical wedding of Christian Rosacruz, it was a fantasy story filled with alchemy and symbolism. It referenced the manifestos and possibly the real-life Bohemian royal wedding. It's a fictitious story of a hero called Christian Rosacruz. But who is this mysterious figure? Johann Valentin Andrea eventually is the credited author for Chemical Wedding. He came from a Lutheran family and dreamt of a resolution to religious turmoil of the time. Andrea wrote his first version of Chemical Wedding 14 years earlier in 1602 as a teenager attending college in Tübingen. 1616 was when the actual Chemical Wedding was published, and this can be seen as a remix of his original story mixed in with the current events that were playing out around his area. We'll talk more about the Chemical Wedding story later, but first let's look at what inspired Andrea. Yates dives into the possibility that perhaps he was inspired by the Order of the Garter ceremony where he attended school in his early years. The Garter ceremony was an English-German celebration with King James trying to nurture ties with German Protestants. It entailed English actors, musicians, and a feast and celebration that lasted until the morning. There was a literary work that came right after that ceremony called Neomantria. It's a cryptic allusion to a secret alliance or evangelical league. This league could have perhaps been a union between France, England, and Germany, which are symbolically represented by the lily, lion, and nymph. King James seems supportive in these early years. Christian Anhalt made plans to make Electoral Palatine his ideal head of anti-Habsburg forces in Europe. Anhalt, who had many contacts in Bohemia, was the orchestrator of Frederick's failed reign. Anhalt was Calvinist, but like many other German Protestant princes during that time, he was involved in mysticism and Paracelsus movements. Now we'll look at John Dee. Surely Anhalt was in the sphere of John Dee and Edward Kelly's influence, who had passed through the region of Bohemia 25 years earlier. Dee's influence in the region can be seen in the manifestos. In the manifestos, there's word-for-word quotation from John Dee's prior work, Monis Hieroglyphica. Monis combines magic, Kabbalah, alchemy, and mathematics, and it can be seen as a reference to other occult works in the region during that time. Yates quotes, "The strangely exciting suggestion is that the Rosicrucian movement in Germany was the delayed result of Dee's mission in Bohemia over 20 years earlier, influences from which became associated with the Elector Palatine. A movement that solves religious problems along mystical lines, suggested by Hermetic and Kabbalist influences." We'll move on to chapter 4, titled The Rosicrucian Manifestos. Okay, so to recap, the royal wedding took place in 1613. where the king and queen reigned in Heidelberg Castle. The manifestos came out in the years immediately following. And what we're going to look at next is the manifestos and what may have influenced them, including if the wedding did. So, regarding the manifestos, evangelical leaders might have seen them as an alternative to the Jesuit order in the tumultuous time preceding Rudolph II's death. The first manifesto, Fama, was basically a widespread call for reformation. It was written in German. It included the character Brother Rosacruz, who was said to be an illuminated man who traveled the east and saw a cohesiveness going on there. He put out a call for collaboration of German magicians, Kabbalists, physicians, and philosophers. Brother Rosacruz travels to Spain to spread this message, faulting the Catholic Church for darkness which was projected across the land, but he was rejected. He wanted to shine light in all faculties, including science and the arts. He lived in the 14th and 15th century, built a house where he meditated on his philosophy, studied the mathematics, and made scientific instruments. He founded the Fraternity of Rosacruz, which included 4 members. They used a magical language and coded writing. They had a few rules, which were to dress normal and meet once a year. The Fama says the burial vault of Rosacruz was rediscovered, and it was found with Paracelsus writings inside. This discovery of treasures marked the beginning of Reformation for the world. The second manifesto, Confessio, was not in German but written in Latin. The Confessio was self-described as a closer examination of the secret philosophy. Readers were directed to read Consideration Brevis, based on John Dee's Hieroglyphica. It included secret geometry and symbolism revealed in Hieroglyphica. Confessio was declaring the Pope of Rome the Antichrist, urging the learned of Europe to unite. The idea was to return to a paradise. So what were the effects of these 2 manifestos? The manifestos created a frenzy of people trying to reach out. Followers came to find that the brothers were unreachable or invisible. There was a river of printed works that came afterwards. Yates notes that a new dawn of ideas of magic and Renaissance Hermetic Kabbalism, not uncommon for that time, only flourished. The consensus was that the opening of the Rosacruz vault was symbolic of an opening of the door in Europe. New ideas based on the rediscovery of secret knowledge were the driving factors behind these movements. German scientist Andreas Libavius was a well-known enemy of these movements. Andreas accepted Paracelsus' science but rejected the mysticism. He wanted a more academic approach. Libavius was against the microcosm-macrocosm model, against Hermes Trismegistus, and against magic and Kabbalah in the Renaissance tradition. Libavius rejects the manifestos for political reasons as well, one of which being a passage referencing a lion overthrowing the Roman Empire. The lion happens to be the symbol of Frederick V. Alright, so I apologize for that. Yeah. It's like it stalled right over the Bahamas. And we're banking on it. Going north. Missing us here. But, had to go out there for a minute. Anyway. We're moving on to chapter 5, titled The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosacruz. So, what we want to know is, if there's an underground esoteric movement going on in Germany, what was their philosophy? You know, what's the mechanisms behind it? So, descriptions of Heidelberg Castle during Frederick and Elizabeth's reign are lost, but the chemical wedding might offer clues as to the philosophies going on around that court and further what the culture was and what the castle held. Before the 30 Years' War now, Heidelberg Castle was alive with free thought, cutting-edge sciences, and extensive renovation, including the removal of a portion of the mountainside for the gardens. Hold on, let me change this up real quick. We know that a hurricane's bad. So yeah, they cut away the mountainside, brought in some engineers who were driven off of the old sciences, and they made marvels at Heidelberg. The gardens were lively with the courting of influential people. Frederick and Elizabeth's emblem was the Palatine lion, as depicted in engravings that we'll discuss later. Another symbol used is the rose. It's associated with the movements we'll discuss. The rose is an alchemical symbol for virgin. The royal wedding in Bohemia would have been a fresh start for a reformation, just like the wedding depicted in Chemical Wedding. Okay, so once again, we're comparing the two events. One, a real event, another fictitious story, mysteriously written. It's prudent to note that Frederick was linked with the Order of the Garter. Why that's important, we'll discuss. Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosacruz now was published 1616. It's about a romance. It may not have been written by the same author or authors of the manifestos, but it's placed in the same Rosacruz universe. The story was set at a vast castle full of wonders and a marvelous garden. There was a lion at the gate and lion fountains in the garden. This Renaissance design included rooms to serve as a living memory system. And that's something Yates talks about in one of her other books, Art of Memory. So apparently people of those ages were able to remember vast amounts of information by using the technique to create, physical places within their heads. And they would have rooms within these physical places, and they would have striking imagery to help convey thought. So getting a little off track here, but it's just interesting about the art of memory and using memory palaces, if you will, what they're called. Okay, so regarding Chemical Wedding, was this story an allegory about Heidelberg Castle and the alchemical wedding of a noble king and virgin queen, representing a new dawn? That's what's proposed here. So just to skim through the chapters, we covered chapter 1, a royal wedding and the marriage of Princess Elizabeth and the Elector Palatinate, that's Frederick. Chapter 2 was about their Bohemian tragedy when they took the crown of Bohemia and got ran out of there quick. Chapter 3 was about John Dee and the Christian Rosacruz. Chapter 4 was the Rosicrucian manifestos, where we actually look at the manifestos that came out shortly after the wedding. And chapter 5 was the third work, Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosacruz, and we compared that to the royal wedding that happened at Heidelberg Castle. So next, we're going to look at other writings that came after these movements, most specifically from Flood and Meyer. Okay, so chapter 6 is titled Flood and Meyer Writings. These writings took place when the king and queen were still at Heidelberg Castle before they accepted the crown of Bohemia. So if we want to piece together more about the currents going on in Heidelberg and the movements that were behind them, we need to study writings of the few writings that we have of people who supported Rosicrucianism. And that brings us to Flood and Meyer. So obscure religious movements moved through publishing houses during that day. Excuse me. Robert Flood and Michael Meyer were two leading writers who supported the Rosicrucian movement. They published from 1617 to 1619 in Oppenheim in the Palatinate, where Frederick reigned. Both were revered Paracelsus followers. Both published with the same publisher, Johann Theodor de Bry. One was Lutheran, one was Anglican. Both were Hermetic philosophers. One tended to lean more towards writing about the macrocosm, macrocosm, the other towards spiritual alchemy. So you can say one was Hermetic philosophy and the other alchemical symbolism. We do know that esoteric Christian circles existed in England and Germany during that time. So let's talk about the publisher. Theodore de Bry had a publishing and engraving company. He was in high demand during the Elizabethan age. He was attracted to Oppenheim, a Palatinate town, for its tolerance of free thought. He was closely associated with the Heidelberg court. It's where we get a lot of the engravings that we have detailing the underground movement and the philosophy in Germany surrounding these groups. Flood was an Englishman and Meyer was a Bohemian. Both followed alchemy of Paracelsus. Meyer was close to a liberal Catholic Emperor Rudolph II. Flood revered ancient wisdom of Hermeticism, writes about Rosacrucian manifestos and their attacks by Libavius. He defended the Rosacrucians as being against the Pope, but perhaps illuminated by God, maybe not heretics after all, he suggests. He wants to join their company. In his writings, he defends good magic and magicians who are experts in math. He's a proponent of arts and sciences in their advancement, like John Dee. Years later, he's criticized for some in England, but said he never met any Rosacrucians. He got no reply, in his own words. He defended himself by explaining that even some Jesuits liked his writing, barring the sections on geomancy. He dedicated his work to James I, but James did not want any association with the political aspects of Bohemia or philosophy involving magic and Hermeticism. So the same way that James rejected being associated with that is the same way that James shied away from the works of John Dee. Flood's work presented magic, Kabbalah, and the addition of alchemy. The events in Bohemia in 1620, when Frederick was overthrown, didn't deter Meyer either. He talks of a Hermetic rebirth, with heavy emphasis on the phoenix. Yates includes this section to show the link between Flood and Meyer writings and Frederick of the Palatinate movements, showing a culture of influences by the Renaissance and Reformation inspiring the Rosacrucian movement. Chapter 7, the Rosacrucian Führer in Germany. So here's other post-Rosacrucian publications, or post-manifesto publications. The Rosacruz myth was a type of magic parable. Heidelberg Library was lost, but some of the works remain. One mysterious drawing shows a peculiar building called the Invisible College. This drawing is full of symbolism referenced in the Fama, with even the words Jesus Nobius Omnia directly quoted. The whole scene is a macrocosm with a new movement at hand with influence indicative of a Hermetic Protestant hybrid of a philosophy. Another writer, Joseph Stellatus, wrote The Pegasus of the Firmament, and he quotes the manifestos as well. In it, he reveres Hermes Trismegistus. He gives one of the clearest definitions of alchemy as an ancient theology which encourages inquiry into nature. Yates examines other authors supporting Rosicrucianism and their themes of science, nature, ancient knowledge rediscovered, and a mysterious RC brotherhood in the middle of it all. The anonymously published Rosa Florescens talks about studying nature to return to the paradise that Adam lost. Another writer, Jacob Boehm's mystical philosophical writings are reflected in the manifestos. Boehm was in Prague in 1620, yet no Rosicrucian connections are known. German publication of the topic came to a sudden stop in 1621 with the collapse of the Palatinate and beginning of the 30 Years' War. There were warnings published against Rosicrucian vermin from groups including the Jesuits. Interesting note, the Jesuits actually took over Rosicrucian symbolism in Counter-Reformation. Bohemia thus lost touch with Rosicrucian movements under the Catholic control, but the movement spread to France. Chapter 8, the Rosicrucian Scare in France. During 1623, there was witch crazes across Europe as the Rosacrucians were spreading in France. Placards appeared in Paris announcing the presence of the RC Brotherhood. Rumors spread like wildfire. Counter placards had accused the Rosacrucians as being a secret set of devil worshippers. Witch trials multiplied all over Europe with the Catholic reconquest. Let's take a look at some of the French commentary. In 1623, Gabriel Nouaud's instruction to France come to the RC's defense. He lists writers that inspire Rosicrucian thought, and here we can crystallize the philosophy. He lists D. Hermes Trismegistus, Paracelsus, Bruno, and other Renaissance-style writers as being influential to the Rosicrucian thought. Now we can see that the RC movement is firmly placed in the Hermetic tradition. It can be seen as a struggle of Renaissance Hermetic Christians versus Catholic powers. 2 years later, in 1625, Naud's apology for great men suspected of magic was even bolder, breaking magic down and differentiating good versus the evil type. He includes a list of good magicians, including many of the philosophers that inspired the Renaissance. He warned that advanced math and sciences could seem magical to the ignorant. Naud toes the water with caution. In opposition, French monk Marin Marcin, who was Jesuit schooled, attacked the whole Renaissance tradition. Flood, a contemporary exponent of the Renaissance, retorted, and the debate became a spectacle for those following. Marcin was noted as helping to usher in the 17th century shift from magic to mechanism. A friend of Marcin, René Descartes, also Jesuit schooled, had a biography that revealed his travels outside of France to Germany in 1619, where he was said to be enlightened while in a cabin in the winter wilderness. There he found math to be the key to understanding nature. Descartes returned to Paris in 1623, and he was accused of being a Rosicrucian. He decides to show his face in public, proving he is not one of the invisibles. It's funny how this Jesuit writer, Descartes, the philosopher, who said, "I think, therefore I am," that man, it's funny how he travels to Germany, goes in the wilderness, has some sort of enlightenment during the time of the manifestos and the movement in Heidelberg. So you could see the dots starting to connect here. Also, years later, Descartes relocates to the area where Elizabeth, the Winter Queen, is in exile. So later on, Frederick and Elizabeth went into exile, and in Elizabeth's later years, Descartes relocated to the area around where she was in exile, and they were in correspondence with each other. So he dedicated his 1644 Principia, however you want to pronounce that, giving her the title Queen of Bohemia, which her enemies had denied her. So to explain the Winter Queen, because Elizabeth and Frederick only reigned for 1 year during the winter, they became, I guess, infamously known as the Winter King and Queen of Bohemia. So chapter 9, Francis Bacon, Under the Shadow of Jehovah's Wing. As the Rosicrucian movement was spreading in France, there was little impact in Britain. Instead of the manifestos, the hot topic was Francis Bacon. Bacon's writings were less magical and hermetic. King James avoids certain science because of its association with magic. Bacon tiptoes around the whole subject. What he does do is call for a brotherhood in learning that transcends national borders. This learning, or illumination, was to lead back to the garden. He attacks Paracelsus, the microcosm-macrocosm, and the idea of groups that meet in secrecy. The Elizabeth-Frederick, or English-German connection, did facilitate an exchange of ideas. Elizabeth, in her later life, was interested in the works of Bacon. Meyer was interested in Bacon. Bacon's book, New Atlantis, may suggest he was influenced by Rosicrucians more than he would lead on. It wasn't published until after his death. In New Atlantis, there's a utopian society that's depicted, built around religious and scientific advancement. It's a fictitious story of travelers finding the lost Atlantis. They come to find an advanced society in isolation from the rest of the world. So they find the island of Atlantis and they find an advanced society with people who are purposefully in isolation and with heavy religious underlinings. In it, you can see the same things of an invincible college engaged in world affairs from the rear for goodness sake. Both New Atlantis and the Rosicrucian manifestos are hypothetical societies influenced by Christian Kabbalah. So we talked about the Rosicrucian movement that came out of Germany, how it spread to France, what was going on in England across the water during the time, and now we're going to talk about the effects it had on Italian liberals. And chapter 10 is Italian liberals and Rosicrucian manifestos. Okay, post-Renaissance Venice was watching very closely. We already know that in 1606 liberal Venetians stood against Rome. In 1616 we have the conversion of Catholic Archbishop Antonio de Domonis to Anglicanism. The 1620 Bohemian defeat struck a blow to liberal Italians as well as Protestant Germans. The Fama included excerpts from Italian intellectual Traiano Boccolini. Boccolini was an admirer of Henry IV of France. Henry IV was inspiring to Giordano Bruno, Christian Anhalt, the Palatinate rulers, and Johann Valentin Andrea. Henry IV's assassination in 1610 was a blow to these circles. Another Italian liberal-minded writer, Tommaso Campanella, ended up in exile and wrote City of the Sun, another utopia ruled by Hermetic priests who excelled because of the scientific magic. His disciples would visit him in prison and bring writings back to Andrea, who would later write his own utopia novels. Modern historians, now we're saying modern at the time of Yates writing this in the 1970s, modern historians did not notice the German-Italian connection of anti-papal intellectuals. Rosicrucian movement can now be described as a new Reformation, picking up where other Reformations had failed, embracing magic science and Hermetic Kabbalism. So we're going to look at a map real quick on that, one of those last notes saying that modern scholars didn't notice the German-Italian connection. And you can see the three areas involved here with, corridors of intellectual movement, Germany, England, and Italy. And I'm sure there was a lot of correspondence, and these underground currents, were watching each other closely and inspiring each other. And you could kind of piece all this together and see where it's going. Chapter 11, the RC Fraternity and the Christian Unions. So in 1617, after Johann Valentin Andrea wrote Chemical Wedding, he shifted from the Rosicrucian identifier to a more practical one in Christian Unions. This marked a shift from fictitious RC myth to real societies. The origins of RC started as a mystical joke, but in his eyes it had got out of hand, lacked direction, and was spoiled by outside actors. Besides, it had served its purpose in stimulating thought, and there was an appeal there, as seen by the response it got. Like the manifestos, he advocated a fellowship of intellectual and scientific studies to benefit the advancement of all man. He helped found Societas Christiana. He supported drama or play scenes as an important aspect, just as the Jesuits did in that time. The popularity in drama helps explain the RC model of conveying ideas, fiction. Andrea wrote a new fiction called Christianopolis in 1619. Christianopolis was in line with other 17th century utopias. It dealt with a city employing a mixture of mystical and scientific technology. The city's artisans are educated men and work people who were entitled to exercise their inventive genius. Painting, math, astronomy, and a combined divinity with philosophy is explored as theosophy. The study of natural science is a religious duty in this city. Also, music with a background in arithmetic and geometry are heavy components. It's basically a John D version of Campanella's City of the Sun, dealing with math, fine arts, inventiveness of the artisan class, and angel work. Citizens in this city are what we might call devout esoteric Christians. Would this be the framework of a real group or groups, i.e. Christian unions? Letters by Andrea, recovered by historians, talk about factual groups that were broken up by the wars. Directly quoted, "Nothing approaches nearer to God than unity. For this reason, wise men have gathered into societies, but Antichrist is against this." Others formed their own unions modeled off of Andrea's writings during the 30 Years' War. Okay, so here's an interesting note on the secrecy involved. There was mysterious word Antilia, the name of an island that seems to have been a type of password used by various groups. Chapter 12. Comenius and the Rosacrucian Rumor in Bohemia. Comenius grew up in early 17th century Bohemia. He was inspired by Andrea and the movements coming out of Heidelberg. He was at Frederick and Elizabeth's coronation. He developed Pansophic Encyclopedia in 1614 based on universal knowledge. In 1621, Spanish troops captured his town, burned his house and library. On the run, he lost his wife and one of his children. He arrived in Brandeis and wrote the Czech classic, The Labyrinth of the World. It was an amphitheater of all things of the world. It was influenced by City of the Sun and Christianopolis, but a dystopia unlike the other utopic works. Labyrinth was a city representing all the sciences, learning, and occupation of man leading to ruin. It is suggested by Yates that this is a living memory system detailing the failed Rosicrucian Bohemian movements. Comenius wrote in despair, seeing these failed movements mixed with his personal losses in the war at hand. Comenius was still interested in the prophecy of Frederick's return as King of Bohemia. This is at a time when Frederick was in exile. I gotta put my computer on charge here, but got Google. What the am I saying tonight? Got Google Documents loaded. You gotta love it. So let's recap real quick. Yes, we talked about the royal wedding that happened, the Bohemian tragedy. We talked about John Dee's earlier travels through Central Europe that may have inspired both the royal wedding and the Rosicrucian movement. We talk about the Rosicrucian movement in itself with the Rosicrucian manifestos and then the chemical wedding by Andrea. We also talk about other writings by Flood and Meyer. We talk about the Rosicrucian furor in Germany, how it spread to France. We talked about what was going on in England with Bacon and his works. In Italy with Italian liberals. We just got done talking about the RC fraternity and Christian unions, so it going from a fictitious, story to possible real groups. And then Comenius and the Rosicrucian rumor in Bohemia. Now we're going to talk about chapter 13, from the Invisible College to the Royal Society. So we already know after 1620, the Habsburg powers came in and along with the Counter-Reformation practically vanquished all opposition. Protestant Europe had failed. Frederick spent years after trying to recover his Palatinate title. Frederick represented Calvinism with esoteric underlinings. During the 30 Years' War, King of Sweden Gustavus Adolphus saved the Protestant cause and was supporting of Frederick's plight. Adolphus marched into Germany and crushed the Catholic army, which was the Holy Roman Empire's armies. Unfortunately, in 1632, both Augustus and Frederick died. They died in the same month and were mourned together in Prague. Elizabeth, the royal widow now, reigned alone at The Hague. Her youngest daughter, born in Prague, Sophia of Brunswick, became Electress of Hanover, whose son George I was the first Hanoverian king of Great Britain. So what that's saying is Frederick and Elizabeth's granddaughter actually married a king who became king of Britain. So the Stuart monarchy, in a sense, was represented once again in the royal court. So regarding Elizabeth the widow, she spent the rest of her days in Hague, and Englishmen passing through would pay their respect to the Queen of Bohemia. So she was still highly revered. She was popular with Protestant leaders and parliamentarians. So when Parliament overthrew the monarchy, which was around 1650, parliamentarians still respected Elizabeth of Bohemia. 3 visitors to the court in particular were Hartlib, Dury, and Comenius. Hartlib left Polish Prussia in 1628 after Catholic conquest of Elbing. He linked up with John Dury. Hartlib collected refugees and set up a school in Chichester, interested in philanthropy, education, and scientific undertakings with an invisible religious enthusiasm. 1640 Parliament met over anger that Protestantism was going down despite the execution of Stafford, which should have broke the tyranny. Hartlib became good friends with Theodore Hock of the Palatinate, who was a Calvinist intellectual. Hartlib presented a utopia to Parliament asking for Comenius' help. Comenius and Dury appealed to Parliament. Parliament adopted their ideas as the future of Reformation, or a blueprint, if you will. If you connect Rosacrucianism to the later philosophy like the Utopias, you can see this period involving British Parliament as a revitalization of the efforts. Bacon's influence can be seen through Comenius with an emphasis on colleges and organizations dedicated to the spread of light using technology from the previous age like navigation and printing. 1641 turned out to be a false dawn. In 1642, England drifted towards civil war, and Parliament had to put universal reformation on hold. We're going to explore the Royal Society now. Theodore Hock was credited with starting meetings that started the Royal Society. A 1646 letter from Robert Boyle mentioned an invisible college. Bacon's writings also alluded to a secret group of philosophers engaged in Reformation. Andrea alluded to this as well. Yates examines the possible link from the Rosicrucian movements of the 1610s or 1620s to the Royal Society in the 1640s. Yates highlights Royal Society influencers like John Wilkins, quoting from the Fama, and Bacon as well. A 1648 meeting at Oxford marked the beginning of the Royal Society. In 1660, the Royal Society was officially founded in London. Let's compare 2 Royal Society members from the early days. John Webster urges the philosophy of Hermes by the Paracelsian school, with the inclusion of Baconianism. Seth Ward of the Oxford group criticizes Webster for assimilating Bacon with Flood, Bacon being the scientific and subtle about the Rosicrucian influence, and Flood being a full-out Hermetic philosopher in the line of D. There was a general disassociation with magic since it was still a sticky subject. The witch scare was primed up and already taken place across Europe. There was a smear campaign that blasted John Dee for 300 years, including the 1659 publishing of Dee's spiritual diary detailing his conversations with angels. 1660 Parliament appointed Cromwell dead in the restoration of Charles II. The Parliament army quietly disbanded. There was a campaign against Illuminists spreading at the time, which is French writings predating Illuminati, and Hermes/Paracelsus influenced thinkers, which were under attack. Another figure, Robert Hooke, tried to rescue Dee's reputation by saying the diaries were a concealed history of art and nature. The Royal Society exercised caution by dropping Dee and making their Baconianism non-offensive. The witch scares made religious matters taboo in the Royal Society. Only scientific studies were published. So all this was following the collapse of Parliament control, that is, Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth. 1660s England returned to monarchy. The Royal Society was defined, and science as we know it had arrived. We'll grind on. We'll see where this goes. Hopefully it's coming across clear. Alright. So chapter 14. Elias Ashmole in the Dee tradition. One founding member of the Royal Society in whom the Dee tradition was still alive was Elias Ashmole. Elias Ashmole was an English royalist and leader of the alchemical movement in the 1650s. He helped restore Charles II to English monarchy. So we're talking about the English Civil War between parliamentarians and royalists. He was an antiquarian, enthusiast in the Hermetic and Kabbalist tradition, and alchemist. He was known to be the most illuminated brothers of the Rosy Cross. He quotes from the Fama and speaks of Michael Myers' efforts to popularize English alchemy in Germany. He collects alchemical works. He's an advocate of Dee's work, wanting to remember him for his scientific brilliance as opposed to the smear campaign which was going on against his name. Now, this is Dee's travels with Kelly through Central Europe, in which he's smeared for, and the magic he's involved with. So Ashmole was trying to clear Dee's name, and Ashmole published alchemical works of the secret Hermetic tradition, continuing Dee's work. So he revered the Order of the Garter and sought to restore its name. Important to note that around 1690, a young Prince Charles Louis, Elector Palatine, grandson to the Winter King and Queen, had much discourse with Ashmole regarding the order. Ashmole's book on the Garter was distributed in the Palatine court. Ashmole's alchemical and antiquarian studies, like Dee's, were studied by the next Royal Society major player, Sir Isaac Newton. Newton knew of the manifestos and possessed copies of the Fama and Confession. Newton studied Myers' work involving the R.C. Brotherhood. He also heavily studied Ashmole's alchemical texts. The Harley codices in the British Museum speak on German Rosacrucians and where they got their ideas. Dee would be the grandfather of this philosophy. Hermeticism was one of the fundamentals to the philosophy. Ashmole and Newton would prove to be important Royal Society members, Ashmole representing the esoteric work and Newton's work in math and physics, the more scientific publications. Chapter 15. Rosacrucianism and Freemasonry. Yates notes the historical studies of Rosicrucian manifestos have been lacking because the whole subject had been bedeviled by enthusiasts for secret societies. Occult research is not taken seriously enough by historians, Yates counters. Yates concludes that she has found no evidence of a real secret society of Rosicrucians, but rather real movements as detailed with the Christian unions. The Rosicrucian myth suggested the formation of secret societies. Yates speculates, are the manifestos the blueprint for Freemasonry? Yates turns to 19th century researchers J.G. Boole and Thomas de Quincey, who is convinced that when Rosicrucianism was transplanted to England, it became Freemasonry. Robert Flood was responsible for this transplant. So now let's differentiate legendary versus established Freemasonry. Legend is that it dates back to the building of Solomon's Temple. Then it turned into speculative masonry with mystical underlinings and the formations of a secret society. This is where Rosacrucianism comes into play. Ashmole's Masonic initiation is the oldest known record of speculative masonry in an English lodge, dating 1646. Ashmole copied out in his own hand the Rosacrucian manifestos. Yates goes on to examine poems from the medieval era, from the 1400s, on the legendary history of Masonry. In it, we can see geometry derived from the Egyptians, Renaissance ancient wisdom, Hebraic past, specifically Solomon's Temple. Also note that Newton studied Solomon's Temple. Masonic history says the history of the royal art of architecture spread from Hebrews to the Greeks to the Romans. Roman architecture, lost from the barbarian invasions, gave rise to the Gothic style. The Masons sought to regain the lost art of the classic architecture. Speculative Masonry begins after this revitalization, perhaps with Indigo Jones, spread of Augustus style in Vitruvius. Yates wonders why was Dee omitted into history, being a famous Hermetic philosopher and praised of Vitruvius. Perhaps because a smear campaign in his association with conjuring. All the secret movements of the late 16th century might have had sympathy with the movements surrounding the Elector Palatinate. Influences from Giordano Bruno can be found in the manifestos. You can see Hermetic philosophy, Egyptian religion, and good magic. This might have inspired secret societies among Lutheran circles in Germany. The Bruno movement might have appealed to movements in Italy. It might have coexisted with English esoteric movements, i.e. John Dee. Yates, looking at the evidence, Freemasonry must have been connected with Rosicrucian movements. The differences could be Freemasonry combines an esoteric approach to religion with ethical teaching and philanthropy, and their architecture as a macrocosm. Rosicrucianism is interested in the arts, science, magic, and alchemy, basically the esoteric elements of the Royal Society. Okay, that got a little dry towards the end. Nonetheless, good information there. Yates sums up her last chapter as putting together all the research and identifying who the Rosicrucians were, at least in a historical sense. She basically comes to the conclusion that Rosicrucianism could be defined as a style of thinking that is heavily influenced by the Hermetic Kabbalist tradition with the addition of alchemy. That can be attributed to John Dee's travels through Central Europe. 20 years later, during the royal wedding, Frederick and Elizabeth established a court that saw a heavy influence of esoteric movements, as evidenced by the writings that we explored. When they took the crown of Bohemia, that could have been their fatal error, because the Catholic powers quickly overthrew them, ending these movements that were taking place behind the scenes. We took a look at the actual Rosicrucian manifestos, including The Chemical Wedding by Andrea. We looked at the outbreaks in France subsequently. We looked at a movement that was basically on the run during this time, up until the English Parliament when they took over from the Royalists. We saw evidence that English Parliament was willing to get behind this and adopt it as their official blueprint for philosophy going forward regarding the creation of a new world or Reformation. And then we saw the finding of the Royal Society, which basically there were two currents going on within the Royal Society, one being the exoteric version as we know now, purely scientific, academic, and the other having influences of magic and Kabbalah in John Dee fashion that was going on behind the scenes but ended up not being the popular representation of what they were. Eventually, we have a split in the road or a branching of what Yates theorized as being Masonic ideas and Rosacrucian ideas, and they may come from the same lineage. It's differentiated by Masons being mystical philanthropists, and the Rosacrucians having the alchemical, hermetic tradition being their backbone, with the emphasis on arts and sciences and perhaps influencing Western esoteric traditions as we know it today. So that's the extent of it. It's the next morning. I've been editing a little bit. And if you like what you saw, check out Terence McKenna's lecture, his video on, I'll put the link in the description, on the Winter King and Queen. And also get the book yourself. Hope it all came together nice for you. Hope you like it. I'm out.